Hey there. Tonight, we begin with something quietly unpleasant. The life of a medieval thief. Not the daring, swashbuckling kind. No tight leather tunics or rooftop escapes here. Just a tired, slightly cold man named Ellis, who stole bread because his cousin wouldn't share. So before you get too cozy, take a moment to notice your pillow. Is it properly fluffed? Good. Maybe pull the blanket up a bit more. This one's a slow climb into discomfort, like crawling through a turnip patch wearing wet socks. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to the sound of someone else's cough. It's not alarming, just persistent, like a goat with opinions. The room you're in isn't really a room. It's more of a space between walls, built with leftover wood, and dreams that didn't pan out. There's straw on the floor, but only in the middle. Around the edges, it's mostly dirt and crumbs from something that was probably edible once. Ellis blinks. He's our hero, if you can call him that. He's lying under a blanket that smells like old cabbage and disappointment. The blanket is thin, more metaphor than material, and he has to curl his feet in to stay under it. One foot has escaped anyway, boldly poking out into the morning air, which is cold enough to give even the rats second thoughts. He doesn't own much. A dull knife, a sack that used to hold oats, and a hat that's actually just the sleeve of a tunic someone cut wrong. His shoes don't match. One has laces made from twine. The other is held together with a philosophical belief in second chances. The plan today is simple: not starve. Maybe steal something. Maybe not. Depends on how loud his joints are when he walks. Ellis is 30, but looks 40. In medieval years, that means he's middle-aged, slightly hunched, and treated like furniture by anyone with a job. He stretches, scratches his beard, which is less beard and more a suggestion of facial moss, and tries to remember what he dreamed about. It might have been cheese, or a dog made of cheese. Either way, the dream was better than what's coming. Outside, the sun is up, not cheerfully, more like it dragged itself into the sky, reluctantly spilling light over the crooked roofs and puddle-strewn alleys of the village. The mud here is not just mud. It's history, bad decisions, and the flattened remains of things better left unexamined. Ellis steps outside. He immediately regrets it. The ground is soft, like soup with regrets. His foot sinks half an inch, makes a squelch that echoes louder than it should. A chicken eyes him suspiciously. He nods politely. In medieval towns, you learn to respect poultry. Some of them hold grudges. His first stop is the baker. Not to buy anything, obviously, just to see if maybe someone dropped a crust. The baker's boy, a 10-year-old with the self-esteem of a duke, stands guard. He has a stick. It's not sharp, but he uses it with confidence. "Go away, thief," the boy says, without even looking. Ellis sighs. He's not offended. It's just the job title now. Nobody even checks anymore. Once a thief, always a thief. It's less about what you've stolen and more about how thin your shoes are. He moves on. There's a woman selling turnips in the square. Her cart is tilted, and one wheel is missing. The turnips look like they've been through something emotional. She watches Ellis like he's already chewing. He isn't. Yet. Further down, there's a man sleeping upright against a barrel. Ellis considers the barrel, not the man. Barrels sometimes contain food, or at least the memory of it. This one smells like pickled fish and abandonment. He lets it be. The market is in full swing, if you can call it that. A goat escapes. A man yells about radishes, and somewhere someone sneezes with terrifying force. Ellis walks slower, not out of caution, just because that's his speed now. Walking faster would suggest he had something to do. He doesn't. By midday, he's tired of being hungry. So he sits by the old well, which is mostly dry and entirely untrustworthy. The stones are slippery, and it's rumored that the last man who leaned too far in now sells onions from the afterlife. Ellis leans anyway. He's hoping for coins. Not many. Just enough to pretend he's not stealing when he eventually takes something that isn't his. There are no coins, just damp leaves and a frog who seems disappointed to be seen. A woman passes by holding a pie. Ellis doesn't try to take it. He just watches. She walks briskly as if expecting a thief, which she is, but not from Ellis. He knows his limits. Pie theft is high risk. It's baked, it's heavy, and people remember it. You don't get chased for a coin, but a pie that starts a village manhunt. He eats a raw onion instead. Found it in the dirt, half buried, and already claimed by several ants. He brushes it off. It crunches like sadness and tastes like penance. But it's food. Evening comes slowly, like a reluctant tax collector. The village gets quieter. The chickens retreat. The bakers shut their windows. Ellis makes his way back to his corner of not quite house. He lies down. The straw pokes his ribs. The roof leaks a little. Somewhere nearby, someone is snoring with the conviction of a man who's never stolen an onion. Ellis pulls the cabbage-scented blanket over his head. Tomorrow, maybe someone will drop a loaf. Maybe he won't be the one to pick it up. Ellis woke up with his mouth already open, which was both a habit and a mild strategy. The air inside his home was still thick with the scent of damp straw, cold stone, and possibly the ghost of last night's onion. He hadn't moved much in his sleep, partly from fatigue, partly because his blanket wasn't wide enough to allow turning over without negotiation. Somewhere above him, something dripped. It wasn't raining, so the leak came from somewhere else, possibly the neighbor's cooking pot, or a condensation strategy invented by accident. He blinked into the grayish light. It was morning again, which came with all the regular features: back pain, ankle stiffness, and the mild throb of hunger, so familiar, it now felt like an internal roommate. He sat up slowly, dislodging a beetle that had apparently made a bed out of the crook of his knee. "Sorry," he muttered. He wasn't sure if the apology was for the beetle himself or the general state of things. There wasn't a mirror in Ellis's home, but he could imagine how he looked: thin, unevenly, bearded, with hair that obeyed no direction except maybe downward. He rubbed his eyes, scratched his ear, and considered not standing up. Then he stood up. His shoes were where he'd left them, which was a small miracle. People in the village stole shoes. Not good ones, just the kind that barely held together like his. He slipped them on with effort. One of them squeaked in protest, the other remained sullenly silent. He stepped outside. The sky was cloudy in the way that promised nothing. Not rain, not sunshine, just a general blandness, like someone had left the sky in a bucket overnight and forgotten to stir it. The village was already half awake. You could tell because someone had started yelling about cheese that may or may not have existed, and a pig was squealing like it knew too much. Ellis turned toward the bakery again. He knew it was useless, but hunger makes optimists out of fools, and fools out of the hungry. The boy was there again. Same stick, same glare. Ellis didn't approach. He just nodded and walked past, pretending he had errands, pretending he belonged to a category of person who ran errands. Instead, he ended up by the well again, which had now become his unofficial office. He sat on the stone lip and looked around with the detached gaze of someone hoping for a distraction, but only receiving scenery. A woman walked by with a basket of apples, and he did not attempt to steal one. Apples required speed and timing. He had neither. Plus, the woman looked like she'd hit back. Hard. He wandered toward the tannery. It always smelled like wet leather, and ambition gone slightly wrong, but the workers sometimes discarded food scraps behind the shed. Not good scraps, but pieces of things that had touched actual meals. He found half a rind of cheese, possibly goat, possibly brick. He chewed it anyway. It tasted like bitter hope and last year's air. Nearby, a man named Weller was talking about shoes. He wasn't a cobbler, but he knew one. Ellis pretended to listen. Weller talked too much, always had. But he sometimes dropped useful words in the middle of his sentences, like breadcrumbs from a confused pigeon. Today, those words were merchant sleeping wagon and unguarded. Ellis perked up in the way dogs do when they hear the word treat, though he remained physically slouched. He nodded slowly. "What kind of merchant?" he asked with casual interest. "Textiles," said Weller. "Wool mostly. Bolts of the stuff. He stopped outside the inn last night, still there this morning. Horse looks tired. Probably stays through till evening." Ellis said, "Which is what you say when you don't want to commit to a thought in public." He thanked Weller, who was already deep into another story about a chicken that could sense lies, and drifted off. He walked around the edge of the inn, slowly, eyes down. The wagon was there, old but full, canvas cover tied with rope, no lock, no guard, just a dozing horse and a mild sense of temptation. Ellis walked past it without stopping. Then again, each time just a little slower. His hands itched, not with guilt or nerves, just with the quiet hum of opportunity. But even opportunity had a schedule. He waited until just before the bells rang midday. That was when most people were either eating, arguing over eating, or lying about having already eaten. He moved quietly, though not with grace. Ellis had never been elegant, but he was quiet enough. He approached the wagon from behind, untied one flap, and slipped his hand inside. Cloth, lots of it, heavy and soft, not exactly edible, but sellable, if you knew who to ask. He pulled one bolt out blue with a strange pattern and tucked it under his arm like a very fancy fire log. Then he walked, not ran, walked, slowly, as if he'd been carrying it all morning. Past the inn, past the well, past Weller, who gave a slight nod, possibly out of respect, possibly out of confusion. Ellis didn't stop walking until he reached the alley behind the cooper's shed. He stashed the bolt under a broken barrel behind a pile of unused hoop rings. Then he sat down beside it, heart only slightly faster than usual. He hadn't been seen, or if he had, no one cared. That was almost more worrying. But he didn't dwell. Instead, he stared at the cloth. It looked expensive. At least, more expensive than anything he currently owned. He would need to find someone who wanted it. Someone who didn't ask questions. Someone who owed him a favor or didn't mind small lies. He scratched his beard again. The cheese rind had left an aftertaste, and he wasn't sure if it was cheese or shame. Still, he wasn't as hungry now. Not full, of course. Never full. But not hollow either. He looked up at the sky. Still blank. Still undecided, just like him. And somewhere in the distance, the bells began to chime. The cloth didn't move, which was both comforting and ominous. Ellis checked on it again an hour later, lifting the broken barrel lid just enough to see the edge of blue still folded neatly where he had stashed it. No one had disturbed the spot unless you counted the pair of ants traversing its surface with great personal commitment. He nodded to the ants. "Don't tell anyone," he muttered, then gently replaced the barrel and leaned back against the wall. His stomach grumbled again, not from hunger exactly, but from confusion, like it had just remembered there were better days, once possibly involving broth. The alley was quiet, shaded, and just far enough from the main road that no one came by unless they meant to. That was good. He needed a moment to think. Ellis wasn't a planner by nature. He was more of a responder. Life threw things, and he tried not to duck too early. But cloth, like this blue cloth, with a patterned weave that suggested it hadn't been made by bored village wives, it was a problem disguised as luck. You couldn't just walk into the square with it and say, "Hello, would anyone like to buy this suspiciously untraceable fabric?" People weren't clever in the right ways, but they were suspicious by default. Especially when you looked like you hadn't eaten soup in a month. He needed someone with a shop, or a stall, or at least a table. Someone who could pretend they'd had the cloth forever, and no one would dare question their inventory. Unfortunately, he only knew 2 people like that, and one of them hated him, mildly, but still. There was Myrna, who sold old pots, cracked dishes, and items that might have once been spoons, but were now just metallic riddles. She had a small lean-to near the road, where her dog barked at people in 5 languages. She'd dealt in cloth before. Once. That bolt of scratchy brown wool that made everyone sneeze, but she was careful and fond of favors. The other was Tarl. Tarl the button man, which sounded more dignified than he deserved. He sold buttons, strings, bits of ribbon, and occasionally advice no one asked for. Tarl was clever slippery and had a smile that made your spine reassess its alignment. But he owed Ellis, technically. 2 winters ago, Ellis had pulled Tarl's cart out of the mud while everyone else laughed. Tarl had thanked him with a button shaped like a fish and the promise of a favor. Ellis still had the button somewhere. It was mostly sentimental now, or possibly magical, if you squinted. He figured he'd try Tarl first. The man liked shiny things and complicated problems, and this situation qualified as both. Ellis stood slowly, checked the alley for nosy chickens, then grabbed the cloth. He folded it tightly as best he could, then wrapped it in the burlap sack he used for laundry, which was optimistic since he hadn't done laundry in half a year, but sacks didn't judge. Tarl's stall was near the corner of the square where the cobbler's shed leaned against the fishmonger's shed in an architectural embrace of questionable integrity. Ellis walked casually, or as casually as a man carrying a sack of moral ambiguity could walk. He passed the baker again, and the boy with the stick gave him a squint that seemed to say, "I know you're up to something, but I'm too busy being 10 to care today." The square was bustling, which made things both easier and harder. Easier because no one looked too closely. Harder because bumping into someone with a sack full of contraband could end in explanation or escalation. Ellis kept his head down and his pace steady. Tarl was humming when he arrived, a strange, tuneless hum that seemed to change keys mid-note. He was sorting buttons by shape or size or maybe mood. "Ah, Ellis," he said without looking. "I smelled regret on the wind and figured you'd arrive." "I have something," Ellis said, ignoring the greeting. Tarl finally looked up. "You usually do. Lice, poor decisions, debts. What's new?" Ellis opened the sack just enough for the blue fabric to peek out like a bashful scandal. Tarl's eyebrows lifted. "Well, that's not your usual brand of trouble. I need to get rid of it. Quietly. And not for free." Tarl reached out, touched the fabric, rubbed it between 2 fingers like he was checking the thread count of a promise. Merchant's stock. Maybe. Unguarded wagon. Briefly. Tarl nodded, as if the details were just punctuation in a familiar sentence. "It's good. Better than what usually passes through here. Someone's going to miss it. Not if we move it fast." "And where exactly do you think I'm moving it?" "You have contacts. I have acquaintances with bad ethics and worse math skills. They'll want a cut, a story, and a drink. And maybe all 3 at once." Ellis hesitated. "I'll take coin. Half. And no names. Tarl chuckled softly, a sound like buttons clinking in a box. Ellis, you're adorable when you pretend to negotiate. Fine. Half. But if someone comes looking, I've never heard of you, and you've never owed me a fish-shaped button. Fair. Give me an hour. Come back at dusk. And for heaven's sake, try not to look like you're thinking. Ellis handed over the sack. His fingers lingered on the fabric for a second too long, as if part of him didn't trust anyone, especially not someone with a button stand and philosophical eyebrows. Tarl tucked the bundle behind his stall under a faded blanket that once might have been burgundy. Ellis turned, walked away, and tried not to glance back. The square felt louder now. Or maybe he was just noticing everything. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the gossiping buzz of old women discussing a missing pie, the dog barking at a wheelbarrow with personal vendettas. He slipped between the stalls, around the edges, back to the alley. Empty just as he left it. He sat again, waited, let the quiet settle. In his bones, like dust. He'd find out at dusk. If he was richer. If he was caught. If Tarl was gone and the stall abandoned like so many others. He didn't know. All he knew was the bells would ring soon. And someone might be missing blue cloth or looking for a man with a forgettable face. The bells rang exactly when they always did, just after the sun had leaned far enough west to turn the dirt roads gold for half a breath, before the usual mud returned. Ellis heard them while still in the alley, cross-legged, now chewing on a splinter he'd broken off the barrel lid, not for food, just for something to do that didn't involve pacing or inventing regrets. The barrel smelled faintly of pickles and disuse. Every few minutes he checked the sky. Not for weather, he couldn't change that, but for the passage of time measured by shadow creep and the angle of disinterest on the faces of passers-by. Dusk wasn't far. He considered moving early, but showing up ahead of schedule made you look desperate, or worse, guilty. And Tarl was the sort who noticed those things. Ellis chewed the splinter to a soft nub, spat it into the dirt, and finally rose. His back cracked twice in places he hadn't assigned to movement, and he took that as a sign to begin walking. The streets had thinned. Children were being yelled indoors. Chickens herded toward mysterious coops that no one ever seemed to build, and most of the stalls had drawn their curtains or flipped their wares face down, as if sleeping merchandise were less likely to be stolen. Tarl's stall still stood open, which was either a good sign or a clever trap. Ellis approached slowly, casually, the way someone might approach a man who'd agreed to handle stolen goods without any legal encouragement. Tarl was whistling now, a slightly more tuneful version of earlier, as if the prospect of money had straightened out his melody. He didn't look up when Ellis arrived, just continued adjusting a row of bone buttons shaped like flowers. Did it move? Ellis asked after a pause, voice low, almost swallowed by the rustle of wind and straw nearby. Oh, it moved, Tarl replied, still not looking at him. Moved so fast, I barely had time to enjoy it. You sold it already? Traded. Mostly. Coins hard to move clean for fabric that fancy. But I found someone with a purse and a preference for patterns. Tarl finally looked up, his face unreadable except for a slight twitch in one eyebrow that meant either mild triumph or indigestion. He reached under the table, pulled out a small bundle wrapped in dull cloth, and handed it over. Your share. Don't count it here. Ellis didn't. He took it, felt the weight, guessed the contents by heft alone. Enough for a week, maybe 2. If you were careful, quiet, and didn't suddenly decide soup was a daily necessity. You get questions, Ellis asked, only from people who think they deserve answers. And I'm allergic to those types. Anyone. Suspicious. Everyone is suspicious, Ellis. It's how we survive. But no one looked harder than usual. You're still forgettable? That's good. Stay that way. Ellis nodded. He didn't thank him. They weren't that kind of acquaintances. Instead, he slipped the bundle into his tunic, close to the skin, where it wouldn't fall, or be pickpocketed without surgery. You need anything? He asked. It was polite. Tarl shook his head. Just try not to do something noble with it. You're not built for charity. Ellis grunted in reply and turned to leave. He didn't head straight back to the alley. That would have been foolish. Instead, he looped through the square once more, as if looking for something he hadn't found earlier, pausing once at the fishmonger's empty table, pretending to inspect the day's imaginary catch. Then he disappeared down a side lane, across 2 yards, where laundry had been taken in, and finally ducked into a half-collapsed shed behind the Cooper's house. It was quiet here. Even the birds had found somewhere else to be. He sat on a pile of old rope that smelled like the sea had once visited and never been invited back. Slowly, carefully, he unwrapped the bundle. The coin wasn't polished. That was good. Shiny things, raised eyebrows. These were dull copper, and a few bent silver pieces weighted with grime and plausibility. He counted them once, then again. 12 coppers, 4 silvers. One with a nick down the side that looked like a bite from a particularly decisive rat. It wasn't a fortune, but it was breathing space. He could buy bread, a meal at the inn if he wanted to risk the company, maybe even a second-hand shirt with fewer holes than personality. But first, sleep. Not here. Not now. He had one more place to go before the day was properly done. Not for food. Not yet. There was someone he needed to visit. He stood, tucked the coin away again, and made his way east past the edge of the village, where the road began to pretend it was going somewhere important. The house was small, barely a house. More of a leaning structure with one shutter that refused to close, and a chimney that puffed like it was being paid to look busy. Ellis knocked twice on the door, then once more after a pause. A signal of sorts. Familiar. Trusted. The door creaked open, revealing a girl with hair like dry straw and a smudge on her cheek that hadn't moved in 3 days. She didn't smile, just stepped aside. Ellis entered without a word. The inside was dark, lit only by the coals in the hearth and the single candle that leaned like it too was tired of standing. A man sat by the fire, older, thin in a way that didn't come back with food. His cough was soft tonight. Ellis took the stool. "I have something," he said, quietly, reaching into his tunic and removing a single silver piece. He placed it on the table beside the empty bowl that hadn't held soup in longer than anyone admitted. The man didn't look. The girl did. She scooped the coin up fast, eyes darting like she expected it to vanish. "Buy broth," Ellis said. "And bread. Not the cheap kind. The real kind. With crust." The girl nodded, still no smile, but her grip on the coin tightened, as if hope had a handle. Ellis stood again. "I'll come back tomorrow," he added already at the door. The man coughed. Once. A faint acknowledgement. Or maybe just dust. Outside, the night had thickened. A few stars poked through the cloud layer, reluctant but present. Ellis walked slowly, not tired exactly, just aware of how much ground he still had to cover. His stomach complained again, more out of habit than urgency. He ignored it. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once. A cat hissed back. The village settled around him like a blanket made of creaks and far-off whispers. He had coin now. Not much, but more than before. It was a fragile thing, and someone would notice eventually. Someone always did. Ellis walked the road back into town, like a man carrying both coin and consequence. Which, in fact, he was. The silver pressed against his ribs in his tunic pocket felt heavier than it should have, as if it had absorbed all the noise he didn't want to make. Behind him, the girl would be coaxing the fire to life, finding the merchant who still sold broth this late, counting copper with one hand while shielding the silver with the other. She was smart like that. Quiet smart. The kind that doesn't show until you realize she never asked unnecessary questions. He passed the inn again. Laughter spilled through the cracks in the shutters, thick with the confidence of men who had full bellies and unearned opinions. The scent of stewed meat lingered near the door, warm and unfair. He didn't go inside. That sort of coin, even if he had it, didn't buy safety. It just bought a seat near someone louder, someone more dangerous, and possibly someone who remembered your face from a night when something went missing. Instead, Ellis turned left into a street where the cobblestones ended and the mud began again. This was the part of town where carts gave up roofs, leaned on each other like drunks, and chickens roamed with the blank confidence of small gods. He liked it here. Less judgment. More smells true, but fewer eyes that squinted like they were solving you. There was a bakery on this road, not the nice one with the young boy and the stick. A different one, run by an old man named Dunrill, who didn't mind who you were as long as your coin was real and your manners didn't come with shouting. Ellis pushed open the door gently. A bell somewhere above tinkled like it had arthritis. Dunrill looked up from behind the counter. He wore flour like a second skin and blinked slowly, like each customer was a minor surprise. Ellis, he said, as if reading from a very short book. Evening, Ellis replied. Still have the brown crusts. Dunrill gestured with his chin toward the corner shelf. A few loaves sat there, squat and dense, the kind of bread that could be used in self-defense before being soaked in stew. Ellis took one, checked it for softness out of habit, and carried it to the counter. He pulled a single copper from his sleeve, left it on the wood, and waited for the nod. Dunrill gave it. No words. Just the transaction. Ellis tucked the bread under his arm like a scroll of edible diplomacy and stepped back into the street. The warmth of the loaf bled through his tunic, a small comfort. He'd eat it in pieces, some now, some later, some possibly tomorrow, if restraint didn't lose the argument with hunger. He walked past the blacksmith's shop next. The forge had gone cold for the night, but the air still smelled of metal and old anger. No one loitered. Not this time of night. Not in this part of town. He kept moving. Home wasn't far. Not a home in the official sense, more of a nook with aspirations. a space between buildings where the rain didn't quite reach, and the straw was only half mold. Ellis had a blanket there, and a bucket, the essentials. He rounded the corner and stopped. Something was wrong. The alley smelled different. Less like damp cloth, more like someone else's breath. He paused in the shadow of the wall, eyes scanning the dim light that trickled from the upper windows. No movement, but the air held tension. He stepped forward slowly, bread still under one arm, hand drifting toward the dull knife tucked in his boot, not sharp, not fast, but comforting. As he reached the pile of straw, he saw it. The blanket was gone. So was the bucket. In their place, a small pile of broken pottery arranged with theatrical intent. A warning or a joke. He didn't know which. He crouched beside it, touched one shard. It had a red smear. Could have been paint. Could have been something worse. He stood quickly, eyes up, now alert. Someone had been here. Not long ago. Not to steal. There wasn't much to steal, but to send a message. He didn't need to read it aloud. He knew what it said. You're not invisible, which, to a thief, was worse than being broke. He backed out of the alley, heart slow but firm, like a drum played by someone who didn't care for music. Whoever had come, they hadn't waited. That was good. He wasn't ready for waiting. He headed back toward the square, bread clutched tighter, coin still hidden. He needed a new place to sleep, not permanent, just until the echo faded. There was an old barn near the edge of the village, half fallen in, where goats sometimes wandered, but people didn't. He could go there. He didn't like the smell or the way the roof creaked when the wind got opinionated, but it had shadows and a floor that wasn't already claimed. He turned down the road that led there, boots squelching faintly in the night-wet dirt, and as he walked, he counted the people who might have left that broken pottery. Not many. Not specific. It didn't have to be someone he knew. It could have been anyone who noticed a bolt of blue cloth where no cloth should be. Or someone who'd been promised a trade and found an empty stall instead. Or worse, someone who just liked reminding the poor that they could still be chased. He reached the barn. The door creaked open, as if performing a play. Inside, it was dark, dry in the center, damp near the corners. He found an old feed sack, laid it down beside a pile of discarded hay, and sat. The bread came out. He broke a piece off, ate it slowly, chewing longer than needed, partly to distract from the thoughts crawling behind his eyes. He would sleep here tonight. Just tonight. Tomorrow, he'd move again. Find out who had been in the alley. Or maybe not. Maybe just disappear for a while. Go to the next village. Pretend to be someone who used to be someone else. But not yet. Tonight, he had bread, and silence, and a roof that hadn't fallen in yet. The wind picked up slightly, brushing the barn door, just enough to let in the moonlight. And in the thin silver glow, Ellis saw something shift. Just for a moment. Then stillness. Again, Ellis froze. A crust of bread halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixed on the shape that had moved near the edge of the barn. It hadn't been loud, not enough to call it a sound, exactly more like the sense of something exhaling quietly from a shadow it didn't intend to share. The barn itself offered no answers. Just the usual murmur of nighttime wood, the tired creak of beams that had held more rain than hay in recent years, and the occasional flutter from whatever lived in the rafters, bats, probably, or overly ambitious birds. He didn't move right away. You didn't in situations like this. Movement invited attention. Stillness was sometimes mistaken for absence, and that was often the better bet. So he sat, bread in hand, head bowed slightly, pretending to be a sleeping man with nothing worth taking. But inside, every sense stretched outward like fingers in the dark. The shape didn't move again, at least not yet. And that worried him more than if it had. Stillness, when deliberate, had weight. And whoever was out there had practiced being quiet. Ellis knew the kind. He'd been the kind at times. He shifted his legs slowly, letting the weight of his boot fall slightly to one side, as if in sleep, bringing his knife hand closer to his belt. The dull blade was still tucked where it belonged, barely sharp enough to slice bread, but good enough for a warning. He breathed slow, counted to 10. Then again. The air didn't change. Eventually, he decided to speak, not loud, not sharp, just a whisper that could have been mistaken for thought if anyone heard it wrong. If you're here to rob me, you're late. If you're here to talk, speak up. And if you're here to stab me, best do it before the crust dries out. A pause. Then the shape moved again. Closer now, just a step, the kind that pressed softly into loose straw and didn't leave a mark. A voice followed, dry as parchment and twice as tired. Ellis. He blinked. The voice wasn't one he expected, though not unfamiliar. Low, flat, like someone who'd been up too long and come too far to waste words. He didn't respond right away, mostly to buy time. Then he said, "Depends who's asking." The shape stepped into a shaft of moonlight that slanted in through a gap in the roof. It was a man, thin, cloaked. Hood pulled low over a face that had probably once smiled, but didn't remember how. "Name's Bren," he said. "You stole from the wrong merchant." Ellis sighed. Not surprised, just annoyed that the warning hadn't waited until morning. "The bolt's gone," he said plainly. "Traded clean. No trail. You're wasting your threats." Bren didn't move, just stood there like the air was holding him up. "Don't want the cloth. Want the name of the buyer. Don't know it?" Ellis lied smoothly because lying was a currency where facts were too expensive. Tarl handled it. "I took coin. That's all." Bren tilted his head. The moonlight caught the edge of something on his hip. Metal, maybe. A blade? Or a tool shaped like one? "Tarl," he echoed. "Figures." He didn't sound angry. That was worse. People who weren't angry were usually professional. "You didn't come just to chat," Ellis said. "So what's the next part?" Bren took another step, not threatening, just present. "You're not important. But you're visible now. That's your problem." Ellis didn't argue. He knew when a statement wasn't meant to be corrected. So what now? Bren paused again. "The way men do when they're considering whether to make an example of you or just add your name to a list. Leave town. Tonight. Take what coin you've got and vanish. Someone wants to clean the board." Ellis looked down at his bread. He'd eaten 2 bites. It felt like an injustice. "And if I don't?" Bren shrugged. "Then I'm back. Or someone meaner. And next time, it's not conversation." "Tarl, too?" Ellis asked, though he already knew. "Especially Tarl." Bren turned then. No flourish. Just a slow fade back into the dark edge of the barn, like the shadow was absorbing him. Within seconds, he was gone. No sound of footsteps. No rustle of cloth. Just emptiness, where a warning had been. Ellis sat very still. The bread in his hand now seemed like a relic from a different life. He chewed the next bite anyway, slowly, without appetite. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. When he finally moved, it was with the caution of someone walking through a room filled with invisible strings. He stood packed what little he had into a satchel made from an old curtain and tied it shut with a strip of frayed rope. He didn't have much. He never did. But now he had reason to carry it. The village was sleeping, or pretending to. Windows shut, dogs curled in silence. He moved through the streets like wind. Not fast, not loud, just a pressure that passed over the stones and left no prints. He didn't stop at the alley where his old blanket had once lived, didn't stop at the well or the square. He thought briefly of the girl and the old man, thought about leaving a note. But what would it say? "You're welcome. I'm gone. Don't follow." It didn't feel like enough. He paused by the edge of the village near the old post that once held messages from lords and plagues alike. There was nothing pinned there now, just a scrap of torn paper fluttering like it was trying to escape. He looked east. The road curved away into the trees, past farms, past danger, past questions, but not past memory. He took one last look at the rooftops uneven and patient under the moon, and then he stepped into the dark beyond the last house where the world waited like a mouth slightly open. The coin was still on him, and the warning, too. And ahead there were towns that didn't know him yet. He would need a new name, a quiet one that didn't echo in barns or show up in whispers. But first, he needed to keep walking, because behind him, something had begun to stir again. And this time, it wasn't asking questions. The road was less of a road, and more of a memory of one. Packed earth, mostly. Pebbles that had rolled down from somewhere higher and settled in for the long haul. Occasional wheel ruts long since dried into stiff, reluctant grooves. Ellis walked it like a man with no urgent destination, just the pressing need to stay ahead of wherever he'd last been. The night air felt different beyond the village. Not cleaner exactly, but less occupied. The kind of quiet you didn't trust at first, because it lacked the usual arguments. No barking dog, no creaky shutters, no distant snoring of strangers you'd never see in daylight. Just crickets, some wind, and the steady scuff of his boots. He didn't look back. He'd learned that early on. Looking back didn't change what was behind you. It only invited it to notice you were still watching. Ahead, the trees gathered more closely around the road. Not a forest, but enough growth to make you feel observed. The moon slid in and out of view as the branches swayed, casting soft patterns across the ground like a map drawn by someone indecisive. Ellis didn't fear the woods, not in the way villagers sometimes did. They muttered about wolves, bandits, old spirits with vague grudges. But Ellis knew better. The most dangerous thing in any patch of trees was usually a man with a plan and no conscience. He could deal with that. He was, by some definitions, half of one himself. Still, he kept to the path. Not out of superstition, but because the trees held more secrets than he had room for. He passed a small stone marker not long after midnight. just a lump of carved rock sunk crooked into the ground, moss gathering along one edge like a whispered suggestion. It said nothing, but he nodded to it anyway. Some things you acknowledged just in case. By the time the sky began to pale, he'd walked 5 miles, maybe 6. His legs ached in the familiar way, not pain, but long use. The bread had run out somewhere past the 2nd hour, and now his stomach was making polite suggestions about soup or stew, or even just a turnip that didn't ask questions. He ignored it for now. The next village wasn't far, if he remembered right. Henton's Cross, a dot on a map drawn by men who'd never actually visited. He'd passed through once before, years ago, under a different kind of trouble. The place had a tavern, a blacksmith, and a very unfriendly duck, with territorial issues. Not much else. But it would do. He arrived just as the sun finished rising, pushing pale gold across rooftops that leaned at different angles, as though the houses had been arguing about which direction to face. Smoke curled from 2 chimneys. One wagon creaked down the main street, pulled by a mule that looked deeply skeptical about the day ahead. Ellis stepped off the road and into the edge of the square. No one looked at him, which was good. He needed to be a background presence, the sort of man who blended into the scenery of someone else's morning. He slipped behind the old, well-dry, cracked, decorated with a single rope that hadn't held a bucket in years, and took a seat on the low wall beside it. From there, he watched. A woman swept her stoop with more intensity than dust required. A man carried a sack of something heavy from one door to another and pretended not to notice how many eyes tracked him. 2 boys argued over a coin, not noticing it had already rolled into the gutter. Normal, mundane. The kind of scene that felt safe if you didn't stay long enough to hear the rumors. Ellis waited until the bakery opened late, but it opened. A squat building with soot-streaked walls, and a chimney that wheezed like it was thinking about retirement. The man behind the counter was new, or maybe just unfamiliar. Ellis approached carefully, not too cautious, just the pace of a man who respected bread. He slid a copper onto the counter, nodded toward the nearest loaf, and received it without comment. Good. He stepped back into the square, found a shady spot under the blacksmith's awning, and began to eat. Slowly. Like someone who might not have another meal today. The blacksmith came out. Briefly saw him, gave a polite grunt, and went back inside. Ellis didn't react. He chewed, swallowed, and kept half the loaf for later. After the second bite, he began making a list in his head. Places to sleep. People not to trust. signs to watch for names, muttered too casually, glances held a beat too long, coin exchanged without purpose. The village was quiet, but quiet was never permanent. Eventually, someone would come through asking questions. Maybe not about him, not at first, but eventually. He'd seen it before. Towns that whispered instead of shouted, doors that stayed shut too long, inns where no one ever sat near the back wall unless they knew how to use it. Henton's Cross didn't look like that yet, but Ellis wasn't interested in waiting to find out. He'd stay a day, maybe two, just long enough to trade the last of his silver for something resembling a plan. There was a peddler near the South Road, he remembered. Old woman, sold herbs, gossip, and occasionally things you weren't supposed to ask about. He'd visit her before nightfall. Until then, he'd watch and rest and try not to think about the man named Bren or the way his voice had held no anger, just certainty. That was the part that stuck with him. Not the warning, the confidence. People like that didn't bluff. They delegated. And if someone was already headed for Tarl, then time was short. Ellis folded the rest of the bread in a scrap of cloth, tied it with twine from his satchel, and stood. The village clock hadn't rung yet, but he knew the day was already moving. And somewhere along that dusty main road, boots were walking. Not quickly, just steadily, the kind of walk that always reached you. Eventually, Ellis made his way to the southern edge of Henton's Cross with the quiet purpose of someone pretending not to need anything while needing several things all at once. The loaf of bread he'd saved was tucked under one arm again, though it had grown less of a meal and more of a symbol, a small, edible reassurance that he hadn't yet fallen into complete instability. The road past the square sloped slightly downhill, a gentle curve lined with low stone walls and hedges that had been trimmed into disinterest. Here the houses grew sparse, traded bricks for boards, and began to lean with the resignation of structures that had long accepted rain as their landlord. He remembered the peddler's place before he saw it. A patch of earth that could have been a garden or just a very enthusiastic collection of weeds, a sagging shed that might have once been red, and a wooden bench out front, so uneven it required negotiation to sit on. She wasn't outside, but that was expected. Morning was early for her kind. She dealt in the sort of trade that liked to wait for the day to ripen, when gossip had warmed up, and buyers were loose-lipped from cider or frustration. Ellis paused at the gate, half a gate, really, one hinge holding on with the stubbornness of a limb that hadn't heard the news yet, and gave a polite knock on the post beside it. "You're early," came the voice, dry and flat from somewhere inside the structure. He didn't flinch. "So's trouble," he replied. A long pause followed. The door creaked, not open, but inward, as if the building itself inhaled. Then she stepped out. Greva was small, thin, like an exclamation point, drawn in charcoal, and wore layers that might once have been clothing, or might still be depending on how you measured usefulness. Her eyes were sharp, but sleepy, as though she didn't need to blink to understand things. She looked him up and down and said, "Name Ellis," he offered, then added, "Today." She nodded once. "Sit." He did carefully, on the least wobbly corner of the bench, adjusting until the angle felt almost reliable. Greva lowered herself onto a crate nearby, with the grace of someone who had done this with every kind of pain. For a moment, they just sat. Two people too aware of time to speak quickly. Then she asked, "You've got something to lose." "Only what I can't carry," he said. "But someone might be looking anyway. For you. For what I touched. And did you leave fingerprints or regrets? Both, probably." She sniffed. Not with disdain, just to buy a second before thinking. "What do you want?" "Names. Roots. A way forward. Quiet. Maybe a bed not made of hay for one night. That's a lot of things," she said. "You want tea too? If it's cheap." She gave him a look that might have been amusement. Then stood, disappeared inside, and returned with a cup of something steaming and grayish. He accepted it. Didn't ask what was in it. With her, the less you knew, the less you owed. Greva settled again, arms folded into her shawl. "You're headed south," she said. "Or you will be." "Why south?" "Because north means questions. West is hills, and more people like me, but less kind. East is sea. You don't strike me as someone who sails without drowning." Ellis took a sip of the tea. It tasted like warm leaves and tired boots. "South it is, then." She nodded. "There's a trader's wagon heading that way. Late afternoon. Old couple harmless, unless you try to sell them a chicken disguised as a duck. They might take a traveler, especially one who doesn't ask for food. You know them. I know everyone who uses this road and doesn't leave garbage behind. They're decent, smell like soap, which is suspicious, but forgivable. Will they ask my name? They'll ask your story. Make sure it's boring." Ellis gave a half smile, brief and bland. "That's my specialty." Greva reached into a pocket, pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She handed it over. "For your next place, sell it. Trade it. Bury it. If you have to." He unwrapped it slowly. A small bundle of dried herbs, 2 buttons, 1 brass, 1 bone, and a coin so worn it might have been a pebble in disguise. "What is this?" he asked. "Insurance, or inconvenience. Depends who finds it. What's the cost? Tell no one where you got it, not even yourself." Ellis nodded, rewrapped the bundle, slipped it into his satchel. "Thank you." "I didn't help," she said, standing again. "You just passed through while I was looking the other way." He stood too. "Understood." She went back inside, leaving the door open, just long enough for the steam of something cooking to trail out and vanish. Ellis took the tea with him, finished it halfway down the road, and placed the cup gently on the edge of a fence post, balanced just so. Someone would find it, or the wind would. The wagon she'd mentioned wasn't hard to spot. 2 horses, both with the attitude of beasts who knew they deserved better. A driver with a back like a question mark, and a woman beside him who was arguing with a goose in a crate. Ellis approached slowly, adjusting his posture to travel-worn but friendly, and offered a nod. "You heading south?" he asked. The woman stopped. Mid-sentence, eyed him, then looked to the man. The man sniffed, squinted, and said, "You good with geese? I ignore them until they ignore me." "Good answer. You smell decent enough. Climb in back. No talking unless we talk first." Ellis nodded, hoisted himself into the wagon, and settled on a sack of something soft and unlabeled. The goose honked once less aggressively now, and turned away. The wagon creaked into motion, a moment later, rumbling over stones and regrets, and Ellis leaned back into the sway of forward movement. South, then, with a bundle of strange things in his satchel, and a past that was only a mile behind, maybe 2, but not far enough to relax. Not yet. Not until the road turned and the village was truly gone behind him. Not until he saw something unfamiliar enough to forget what he'd left behind. Not until the wagon rolled along the southern road with all the enthusiasm of a tired ox headed to its own retirement wheels, groaning in protest each time they dipped into one of the many shallow ruts, pretending to be part of the landscape. Ellis sat in the back among sacks of flour, a coil of rope, a jar of something pickled that leaked slightly with every bounce, and the occasional soft thump of the goose shifting indignantly in its crate. The couple hadn't spoken to him again since inviting him aboard, but the silence was the agreeable kind, not suspicion, just disinterest tempered by long miles and mutual understanding that words were not the most important cargo. the woman occasionally muttered to the goose, but even those conversations were beginning to slow as the sun climbed toward its midday slump. The road itself was mostly empty. A few fields sprawled lazily to either side, some with rows of tired cabbage, others with nothing but weeds, pretending they'd been planted on purpose. Every now and then, they passed a farmhouse, the kind that looked too stubborn to fall apart, and too tired to ever be fully fixed. No one waved. Ellis didn't mind. The fewer people noticed him, the better. He used the time to sort through his satchel, carefully checking the bundle Greva had given him. The dried herbs smelled faintly of mint and something more bitter. The buttons were mismatched, but sturdy. The coin was still a mystery, so worn that even its shape was more rumor than fact. He tucked it all back inside without dwelling. Better to keep it close and unexplained. Occasionally, he glanced forward past the driver's shoulders, watching the road dip and rise ahead like it wasn't entirely sure of its direction. South, yes, but not straight. Roads in this part of the world were like rivers shaped more by avoidance than intent. Avoid the marsh, the woods, the property of lords who charged for passage and smiled too much. The wagon veered accordingly. Around noon, they paused near a cluster of trees where a small spring gurgled through moss and stone, sounding far more cheerful than the water's temperature justified. The man tied off the horses and stretched his back like it was a negotiation. The woman climbed down and let the goose out of its crate where it flapped, twice glared at everyone, then set about preening like it hadn't just spent 4 hours fuming in confinement. Ellis took the opportunity to refill his water skin and nibble at the last of his bread, now mostly crust and memory. He chewed slowly, not savoring it so much as respecting its continued existence. "You from Henton's Cross?" the woman asked suddenly. She'd sat down on a flat rock, hands resting on her knees, eyes narrowed against the sun. Ellis swallowed before answering. "Passed through." "Trouble behind you." "Always is. Question is how far." She nodded, neither judging nor curious, just filing the answer under "not my business, unless it becomes mine." The man grunted from the tree line, inspecting one of the wagon wheels with the dismay of someone who'd seen too many splinters. "We'll be at Dollo's Creek by dusk," he said. "Maybe camp before, if the axle starts complaining again." "What's at Dollo's Creek?" Ellis asked, knowing the answer might be less than nothing. Tavern. Mill. Small shrine to a saint who lost a toe. Which toe? Nobody knows. That's the mystery. Ellis nodded, as if that made sense. In this world, it often did. the goose wandered over, stared at him, and made a sound that might have been a warning or a challenge. He stared back. Neither blinked. Eventually, the goose turned away, unconcerned. After a short rest, they loaded up again. Ellis returned to his spot among the sacks. The wagon jolted into motion with less ceremony this time. And the afternoon passed with the sound of wheels over gravel, the soft slap of reins, and the occasional remark about how the sun never knew when to quit. Around late afternoon, the trees began to thicken again, casting long shadows that moved like lazy smoke across the path. A faint breeze carried the scent of river mud and crushed wild garlic. Ellis shifted his position, adjusting his satchel under his arm and peering ahead. The path had narrowed slightly, the trees arching over like gossiping neighbors. He didn't like it. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made birds seem suspicious by their absence. The man up front must have felt it too, because he slowed, the wagon reins pulled just enough to make the horses hesitate. "Something's off," the woman muttered. Ellis nodded, though she hadn't been speaking to him. He sat forward, slightly, scanning the roadside for movement. Nothing but shadows. No bird song. No breeze now, either. Just that heavy, expectant silence. Then a sound. Not loud. A single snap, twigs, or bone, followed by absolute stillness. The Mart muttered a curse under his breath and reached for something tucked under the seat. Not a weapon exactly, but a length of iron bar, with one end sharpened more by use than design. The goose, fluffed up, made a soft hiss, and Ellis instinctively reached for his belt, where his dull knife still lived. They waited. A minute passed, maybe more. Then a figure stepped out from the trees ahead, alone, cloaked hands visible. No weapon drawn, just standing, watching. Lost, the man called out, voice neutral. Not especially, the figure replied. Voice low, male, calm, just looking. For what? A traveler. Someone who went south. With a name he doesn't use often. Ellis exhaled through his nose. Quietly. Not fear. Just familiarity. The woman glanced at him. Not accusation, just calculation. "You want to stay ahead of this?" she asked softly enough for just him to hear. "Then get ready to jump." He shifted eyes still on the figure ahead. He couldn't see the man's face clearly, just the outline, the stillness, the certainty. A second shape moved in the trees to the left, subtle, not yet stepping forward, but present. Ellis whispered, "Now, now," she said. And then Ellis didn't jump, in the heroic sense. No dramatic leap from the wagon bed, no theatrical roll into a ditch, but rather slid off the back like a sack of flour, learning humility, hitting the dirt with a low grunt that blended nicely with the wagon's groan as the driver coaxed it into a sharp veer. The horses, confused but obliging, took the hint and surged forward, hooves clattering across packed soil, jostling the wagon into motion, just as the cloaked figure ahead stepped into the center of the road with the sort of calm that suggested he'd seen this maneuver before and never found it impressive. Ellis rolled once, avoiding the wheels, then scrambled into the underbrush beside the road, keeping low, using the tall grass and scattered brambles as a crude curtain. The woman on the wagon didn't look back, but her voice floated over her shoulder in a dry mutter. "Don't die. I hate explaining things." The goose honked once, shrill and defiant, as if giving final commentary on the entire situation, then disappeared with the wagon into the bend ahead. Ellis crouched ears, tuned for footsteps. None. Just the breeze returning, as if nothing had happened, stirring the branches overhead with the nonchalance of a bystander. He moved quickly, but low-angling off the road into the trees, knowing the figure from the path wasn't alone, that the one in the brush hadn't moved yet, that silence meant planning, and planning meant time was running out. The ground here was uneven, soft, in patches, the sort of forest floor that liked to steal shoes, or at least enthusiasm. He passed a stump, paused long enough to listen. Still, no footsteps, then moved again, ducking under a low branch that scratched his shoulder like an annoyed cat. He could feel his pulse now. Not panic exactly, but the old rhythm that came when being seen had consequences. He'd lived most of his life trying not to be noticed. But when you stole something noticeable, when you tangled with men like Bren, you became visible, whether you liked it or not. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. He didn't stop moving. Not far, just enough to curve away from the road, to put a thicket between himself and anyone with poor tracking skills. He found a shallow dip in the earth, settled behind a moss-covered log, and breathed. The forest creaked faintly. A bird called once hesitantly, as if checking to see if it was safe to resume regular operations. He waited, watched. Nothing moved. That more than anything unsettled him. If they'd followed, they were good. Better than most. If they hadn't, if they'd let him go, it meant something else entirely. He reached into his satchel, felt the bundle Grava had given him. Still there. still, silent. He didn't unwrap it, just touched the cloth and thought about what might be worth this much attention. Not just the cloth he'd stolen back in the village. That had been bartered, already gone, without trace. This was something else. Something about who had bought it, or who had lost it, or what had been hidden in the weave itself. Secrets came in all forms. Some were ink on paper. Some were breath in the wrong ear. And some were stitched quietly into fabric and sent down roads not meant for curiosity. He stayed still until the shadows shifted again. When he moved, it was slower. Not back to the road, not yet. He needed height. Somewhere to look down to see if the wagon had kept going, if the figures were still there. A rise lay to the left, scattered with saplings and patches of grass that remembered the sun. He climbed carefully, testing each step. The slope was kind, not too steep, just enough to let him reach a low outcrop of stone from which he could see a bend in the road below. Nothing. No wagon. No figures. Just the path empty and too quiet, framed by trees like a stage waiting for its actors. He exhaled slowly, more a decision than a necessity, and crouched behind a tree with bark thick enough to believe in. He stayed there unmoving, letting the wind speak again, letting the quiet fill up with its usual noises. When he finally stood, it was with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a different sort of trouble, the kind that moved faster than wagons and quieter than regrets. He turned from the overlook, heading east now, not because it was safe, but because it was unexpected. South was still the plan. Eventually. But first, he needed to vanish just long enough for whoever was watching to blink, or look elsewhere, or doubt the direction. East meant the river. He remembered it distantly, broad slow, the kind that carried barges and rumors in equal measure. There'd be traders, maybe fishermen, people who didn't ask why you smelled like tree bark and fear. It would take a day to reach, maybe less, if the terrain didn't argue. He moved again, weaving between the trunks, stepping over roots that liked to trip the unwary. The shadows deepened as the sun crept westward, turning the forest into a place where light only visited in patches. Ellis kept going, bread forgotten, goose, long gone satchel, bouncing softly at his side. Somewhere behind him, a figure stepped out from the trees, watched, waited, then vanished again, leaving only footprints and the memory of a man who'd seen too much fabric in the wrong hands. The road curved away into silence. The trees listened. And the game, whatever it was, hadn't finished making its next move. Ellis pushed through the last thicket with all the subtlety of a man who had given up on being unnoticed by thorns emerging onto a slope that overlooked the sluggish curve of the river, its brown-green waters moving with the indifferent pace of something too old to hurry anymore. He paused, standing just at the edge of a break in the trees, the scent of damp soil rising around him like a sigh, his boots caked in a combination of effort and indecision. The river didn't look welcoming, but it didn't look hostile either, which was often the best you could ask for from bodies of water in unfamiliar regions. It glistened dully in the late afternoon light, flanked on either side by mud banks and tangled shrubs, with the occasional stump that jutted out like a forgotten monument to a tree's bad luck. He didn't see any boats, which was both a relief and a disappointment. No boats meant no questions. No boats also meant no easy way to follow the river south without inventing a raft or convincing a log to develop flotation skills. He made his way down the slope, slowly careful not to slide, half expecting the ground to betray him just for fun. At the bottom, the mud welcomed him with the soft embrace of regret, sucking slightly at his boots with every step. He found a dry patch near the roots of a leaning willow and sat, not because he was particularly tired, but because he needed to think. He pulled the satchel into his lap, opened it again, and withdrew Grava's bundle. Unwrapped it carefully, laying out its contents like clues in a story that refused to be told in order. The dried herbs crumbled faintly at the edges, but still held their scent, earthy bitter, something medicinal, if you believed in that sort of thing. The buttons were unchanged, the coin still round-ish smooth, like it had been passed through 100 hands and forgotten by all of them. None of it seemed special. And that, more than anything, worried him, because people like Bren didn't hunt for forgotten buttons or neutral-smelling leaves. Something else was happening here. Something hidden. He sat back, eyes on the river, and wondered, not for the first time, if maybe this wasn't about him at all. He'd taken the cloth, yes, but that had been opportunistic, not strategic. Maybe the real target was whoever had touched it last before him. Maybe Tarl. Maybe the merchant. Maybe someone who'd just brushed against it without knowing. That made it harder, because he didn't know the whole story, and the pieces he did have felt like corners of a puzzle made from someone else's regrets. He stood eventually, brushing dry bark from his trousers, and began walking east along the riverbank. The mud gave way to firmer ground after a while, where rocks and roots created a more stable path. He followed it, stepping over fallen branches, ducking under limbs that drooped like tired arms. Occasionally, he paused to listen, but the forest remained politely uninterested in his presence. The sun dropped lower, turning the river into a ribbon of slow bronze. He began looking for shelter, not a camp exactly, just somewhere to wait out the night, without becoming a snack for local wildlife. Eventually, he found a hollow beneath an old oak, its base split by time into a natural alcove lined with leaves and dry moss. It smelled faintly of mushrooms and old rain. He checked it for insects, found only a single slug, and settled in, wrapping his cloak tight and tucking his satchel under his arm. The first stars appeared slowly tentative, as if unsure whether the sky was truly ready for their performance. Ellis watched them for a while, letting his thoughts drift, not quite asleep, but not entirely awake either. Somewhere far off, a night bird called. Then silence again, the kind that pressed in around you when the world decided you weren't interesting enough to bother. He closed his eyes, not to sleep exactly, just to rest. And in the back of his mind, he pictured the river flowing steadily past, carrying secrets and sediment with equal indifference. He didn't know where it led, not exactly, just that it moved forward always and never looked back, like a good thief, like someone pretending he hadn't just stumbled into something bigger than a bolt of cloth and a bag of mismatched buttons. Tomorrow, he'd follow it further, south if it let him, or maybe east if the current changed its mind. Tonight, though, he just breathed and waited and wondered if maybe the river knew more than it ever let on. Ellis awoke just before dawn, not because he was well-rested or eager, but because the cold had crept in through the seams of his cloak and informed him, quite without charm, that lying still any longer would result in a kind of stiffness more suitable to statues than living men. The hollow beneath the oak had done its best sheltering him from the worst of the dew and breeze. But now it felt damp and slightly resentful, like it resented his prolonged use of its hospitality. He stretched slowly, spine clicking in a sequence he hoped wouldn't attract attention from anything nearby with claws or opinions. The river still murmured, nearby unchanged its current, dragging leaves and half-formed thoughts downstream in slow procession. He chewed the last of his bread, a hard lump that no longer qualified as food, so much as a placeholder for hunger, and rinsed his mouth with a sip of water that tasted faintly of whatever had shared the skin last week. Then he stood, brushed leaf litter from his sleeves, and resumed his cautious march southward along the riverbank. The air was heavier this morning, not quite fog, but not far off, curling around the trees in lazy tendrils, as if reluctant to leave. He moved with deliberate quiet, not because he expected to be followed. He'd heard no sign, but because quiet had become habit, and habits made useful companions when you couldn't afford actual friends. Around mid-morning, the path widened into a clearing of sorts, where the trees stepped politely back and allowed a patch of sun to land with casual authority. And there, to his moderate surprise, was a man. The stranger sat on a low stone near the water's edge, sketching something on a piece of parchment held against a narrow board. He wore a wide hat, the kind favored by traveling scholars and men who enjoyed pointing at things with sticks, and a coat patched so many times it had achieved a kind of abstract dignity. Beside him, a pack rested half open, revealing the corner of a bound book and something wrapped in oilskin. Ellis stopped at the edge of the clearing, cleared his throat lightly. Not a warning, just an introduction. The man looked up, squinted, and gave a small nod. "Southbound?" he asked. Ellis blinked. "Mostly." "Same." The man gestured to the rock beside him. "Rest your legs. The river doesn't mind." Ellis approached cautiously and sat. The rock was warm. The stranger returned to his sketching a map by the look of it, lines and symbols drawn in neat strokes, labeled with abbreviations that likely made perfect sense to someone with a preference for riddles. "You make maps?" Ellis asked. "I make questions," the man replied. "Sometimes they turn into maps." Ellis considered that. "You from around here?" "Not since last month." "What's downriver?" The man shrugged without looking up. "A mill? Some houses pretending to be a village? Further still, a town with a name so long no one bothers using it. Beyond that, hills and more questions." Ellis nodded slowly. "Any trouble ahead?" "Only the kind that follows you. Though I did hear a merchant lost some cloth in the last town. Very fine weave. Bit of a scandal." Ellis said nothing, just watched the river for a moment. "People are looking?" The man continued, tone casual. "Not loudly, but with intent. Men who don't like loose ends." "What do they want?" Ellis asked. "Order, maybe, or silence. Hard to say. Not everyone speaks the same language when it comes to loss." The mapmaker finished a line, sat back, and folded the parchment carefully. "You're not the first traveler I've seen with nervous eyes and a cautious step." "And I won't be the last," Ellis muttered. The man smiled faintly. "No, The roads are full of people outrunning something. Doesn't mean they don't have destinations. Ellis stood again, unsure whether to be grateful or uneasy. "Thanks for the company. Thanks for not stealing my ink," the man replied, standing as well. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small strip of parchment, and handed it over. "Safe path. Not the fastest, but overlooked. Follow the ridge south stay above the marshes. Look for the tree with 3 trunks." Ellis took. The paper nodded once and tucked it into his satchel without reading it. The stranger returned to his stone, unwrapping something that smelled faintly of cheese and regret. Ellis stepped back into the trees, following the curve of the clearing, until the river was once again only a voice beside him. The forest felt lighter now, not less dangerous, but less aware of him. He followed the slope upward, searching for the ridge the man had mentioned, forking away from the riverbank with deliberate care. The path was faint, more an idea than a road, but someone had used it before. A line of pressed earth, a scuff on a stone, broken twigs, in places too deliberate for animals. By mid-afternoon, he found the tree 3 trunks from a single root, twisted upward, like fingers grasping for an invisible prize. He touched the bark, gently, almost superstitiously, then moved past it. The air changed here. The ground drier, the light more open. Southward now, with new questions, and the same satchel, following a route given freely by a stranger who asked nothing in return. But Ellis had learned nothing given was ever truly free. Even kindness had a cost. Somewhere the river kept flowing, carrying names he'd never know, and stories that might one day include his own. For now, he walked, quiet, alert, uncertain. The road curved ahead, still hidden, still waiting. Ellis followed the ridge trail as it sloped gradually upward, the kind of incline that didn't seem steep until your legs began to file formal complaints. The trees here were thinner, spaced apart, like acquaintances rather than family, and the undergrowth was more considerate, limiting itself to the occasional bramble patch or stubborn clump of fern. Birds returned to the air, nothing melodic, just chirps and argumentative rustlings that suggested the forest was no longer invested in secrecy. He took this as a good sign. Trouble rarely liked singing. The path bent gently eastward before curling back south, revealing stretches of rolling hills beyond the treetops, dotted with gray stones and thickets of stubborn shrubs. Somewhere down there was the marsh he'd been warned to avoid, visible only as a dark shimmer between the folds of land, like the skin of something sleeping, and Ishals tempered. The wind picked up slightly, bringing with it the scent of water and moss, and something faintly floral, which Ellis chose to interpret as encouraging. The strip of parchment the mapmaker had given him remained folded in his satchel unopened. He didn't need to read it. Directions weren't always meant to be literal. Sometimes they were gestures, a way of saying, "Try here," without the pressure of absolute truth. Around midday, he found a rock outcrop with a view clear enough to see the bend of the river he'd left behind, and the road he'd avoided, a pale thread in the distance that glinted faintly under the sun. He sat, let the wind cool his face, and ate the last of his dried apple slices, tough, chewy, faintly sweet, in a way that suggested they'd once been enthusiastic about life. A pair of hawks circled far above, disinterested in him, but curious about each other. Below, a wagon moved slowly along the road, its driver hunched and solitary, a smear of brown in a green world. Ellis watched it disappear around a bend and thought briefly about where it might be going. Then he stood, brushed his palms together, and returned to the path. The ridge dipped again, leading into a stand of ash trees that whispered to each other with every breeze. Here the light changed, less direct, more dappled, with shifting shadows that made each step feel like part of a larger, more ancient dance. Ellis slowed, not out of caution, but respect. Places like this felt old in ways that maps couldn't measure. The ground softened underfoot, the soil rich and dark, and he could hear the distant babble of a stream hidden somewhere ahead. When he found it, it was barely more than a trickle slipping over stones with the persistence of something that didn't know it was small. He knelt cupped water to his lips and drank. Cold, clean, a little metallic, enough to keep walking. The path continued beyond the stream, winding between trees that had grown so close their roots knotted together above the surface, forming low arches he had to duck beneath. He passed the occasional sign of passage, a snapped twig, a footprint too crisp to be wild, a scrap of cloth snagged on bark, but saw no one. The world here was paused, as if it had taken a long breath and was waiting to see what kind of man Ellis might turn out to be. He walked until the light began to change again, the gold of late afternoon bleeding into everything, softening edges, deepening shadows. The ridge flattened slightly near what appeared to be an old marker stone, half buried, its carvings eroded into suggestion. Beside it stood a post with a rope dangling limply from a rusted hook, perhaps once a bell or a sign, or just something someone had tied in boredom. Beyond that, the path split one trail, continuing along the ridge, the other veering downward toward a valley that looked greener than it had any right to be. Ellis hesitated. The ridge was safety height, vision dryness, but the valley was promising shelter, perhaps water, maybe even food, if the green was honest. He chose the valley, not because it felt safer, but because trouble rarely bothered with the scenic route. The descent was gentle, the path edged with stone, like someone had once cared enough to define it. Ferns brushed his boots. A squirrel watched him pass with the disdain of a minor landlord. And then, just as the sun touched the far hills, he saw it. A small building, low and square, with a slanted roof of moss-streaked tiles and smoke curling from a stone chimney, like a question mark, without urgency. A cottage nestled in the bend of a creek, surrounded by a garden that looked accidental, but productive. Beans on one side, squash on the other, and what might have been a fence if you were generous with definitions. He approached slowly, hands visible, posture casual. The door opened before he reached it. A woman stood there, older hair in a braid, thick as rope, hands on hips that had clearly pushed more than furniture around. She looked at him like she was trying to decide if he was a stray dog or a traveling sermon. "You're early," she said. Ellis blinked. "I didn't know I was expected." "You aren't," she said, "but early all the same. You hungry. Some. Then come in before the soup gives up." He stepped forward, ducked slightly through the low doorway, and found warmth. Real warmth, the kind that came from fire and intention, not just temperature. A pot simmered on the hearth. A table with one chair and another added recently. Walls lined with shelves of jars that caught the light like quiet applause. He stood still for a moment, absorbing it. The woman handed him a cup, wooden, slightly scorched, full of something that smelled of root vegetables and thyme. "Sit," she said, "and don't lie unless you're interesting." He obeyed, sat, sipped, and for the first time in days, let the quiet come without argument. The soup was thick, not quite a stew, but trying hard, filled with root vegetables, diced in a way that suggested the cook had opinions about uniformity, and bits of barley that stuck between Ellis's teeth, just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be resented. He ate slowly, partly because the wooden spoon was slightly warped and kept tilting at inconvenient angles, and partly because the woman who'd invited him in sat across the table watching him with a gaze that could ferment cabbage. She hadn't introduced herself, nor had she asked for a name. She seemed the sort who thought names were useful only when you planned to say them again, which Ellis suspected she didn't. Her house smelled of dried herbs smoke and something faintly metallic, like old coins or sharper truths. On the shelves behind her, glass jars held a mixture of practical things: dried beans, pickled garlic, bits of cloth, twine wound into careful spirals, and impractical ones, such as 3 different-sized bones tied with red string and a tiny wooden horse with 1 leg missing. It was the kind of place you found only when the road had grown bored and decided to play a trick. She refilled his cup without asking, sat back down, and resumed her study of him. Ellis swallowed a mouthful and cleared his throat. "You live here alone?" "That's a question shaped like an observation," she replied. "And neither are answers." "Just trying to make conversation," he said. "Try harder," she replied, and then, finally, a small smile. "I'm Mara. I trade sometimes. I mend mostly. And I'm good at knowing when someone's not just wandering for the scenery." Ellis nodded slowly. "Fair enough." She waved a hand. "No need. You wear your name like it might fall off anyway. Keep it. Doesn't matter here." Silence settled briefly. Comfortable and slightly thick, like soup, left too long on the hearth. Outside, the creek burbled in a way that suggested it had opinions too, but mostly about stones. Mara stood, suddenly, pulled a loaf of bread from a shelf, and sliced it with a motion that said she had cut more than food in her time. She placed a thick slice beside him, dropped another in her own bowl, and returned to her seat with a nod. "So," she said, tearing the bread neatly, "what are you carrying that's got men hunting like hounds with sore feet?" Ellis hesitated. Not in fear, but in the way a man does when he knows a lie would be useless, but the truth might open too many doors. "Something I took," he said. "Something someone else wanted more than I realized. And now I'm trying not to be interesting." She laughed, once, soft and brief. "You're doing a poor job." He chewed the bread, which was dense and laced with rosemary. Not fresh, but honest. Mara leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands folded. "There's a man south of here, lives on a hill, keeps a bell tied to his door because he doesn't trust knocking. Talks like he's forgotten how to whisper, which is strange because everything he says feels like a secret. He might know why someone would follow a man for a thing he doesn't understand." "Does he trade?" Ellis asked. "He bargains," she said. "Different rules." He considered this. "Is he safe?" Mara grinned. "Safer than being followed. Less safe, then forgetting to leave. Outside, dusk arrived like a guest who didn't knock, settling over the trees with quiet authority. Shadows stretched themselves across the floor, thin and crooked, as if the house were remembering old things. Ellis finished the soup, wiped the bowl with the last bit of bread, and pushed it gently aside. Mara stood again, gestured toward the back room with her chin. Bed's there. Not straw. I do have standards. Thank you, he said. She nodded once, already clearing the table. Don't leave before dawn. Roads have ears at night. He stepped into the room she'd indicated. It was small, with a narrow bed pushed against one wall, blankets folded neatly, a small lantern flickering on a stool. A window above the bed was shuttered, latched with a bit of leather that had been tied and retied until it no longer remembered how to be undone easily. He sat on the edge of the bed, removed his boots slowly, and placed his satchel beneath the blanket, close to his side. The room smelled of old wood and dried lavender. As he lay back, the blanket pulled up to his chest. He listened to the faint creaks of the house settling into itself. Somewhere, a wind moved gently past, brushing the edges of the walls, like a hand searching for an unlocked door. In the next room, Mara hummed softly, tuneless, repetitive, the kind of sound that wrapped around a place and held it still. Ellis closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he'd follow her direction, find the man with the bell on his door, and ask better questions. For now, he slept, or tried to, because dreams have a way of arriving when you least want company. Morning arrived without flourish, just the slow blooming of pale light through the cracks in the shutters, and the soft tick of the world stretching its limbs after a night of holding still. Ellis stirred beneath the weight of the woolen blanket, the fabric warm but scratchy in the way that suggested both usefulness and indifference. For a moment, he lay there, eyes closed, listening to the breath of the house, the subtle creaks, the distant mutter of the creek, outside the rustle of wind pressing curiously at the walls like a traveler seeking entry. Then came the smell of porridge, not sweet, but thick and nutty, the kind made for energy rather than pleasure. He rose slowly, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the main room, where Mara already stood by the hearth spoon. In one hand, her braid looped and pinned up like a no-nonsense crown. She didn't look up. "You'll want to leave by mid-morning," she said. "Clouds rolling in. Rain by dusk." "Thanks for the warning," Ellis replied, settling into the same chair as the night before. She ladled porridge into a bowl, slid it across the table, and followed it with a mug of something warm and herbal that smelled faintly of sage and boiled bark. "The man I told you about," she said, finally, meeting his eyes. "Name's Olver. Lives a little off the south ridge. You'll find a split in the trail, just past an old stone marked with a rusted ring. Take the left fork, even though it looks wrong. It is wrong, but that's the point." Ellis nodded, chewing his porridge slowly. It stuck to the roof of his mouth, which somehow felt reassuring. What should I expect? Questions. Maybe silence. He's not unkind, just tangled. Keeps too much in his head. Don't offer him silver, and don't touch the bell unless he tells you to. That one's important. What happens if I do? She shrugged. He might listen. Or he might vanish. Either way, you'll regret it. The rain she'd predicted hadn't arrived by the time Ellis stepped back onto the trail. Though the sky had begun to lower its tone, a blanket of gray hanging just above the treetops, like an unspoken warning. The path south was narrower here, the ridge folding in on itself, roots crisscrossing like a net beneath his feet. He kept a steady pace, satchel tight under his arm, eyes scanning the trail for the promised marker. It came 2 hours later. A flat slab of stone leaned into a crooked tree, its surface worn smooth by weather and time, and embedded just above its center, a rusted iron ring that jutted out like a forgotten handle. Ellis paused there, running one finger along the ring's cold metal. Then he turned down the left path. The way was uneven, littered with fallen branches, and the occasional pile of damp leaves that tried to pretend it was solid ground. The trees pressed closer. Here their trunks gnarled and leaning in odd angles, as if they'd once argued over something and never made up. A mile in, he began to hear it, a faint tinkling sound, irregular and distant, like a bell ringing, not out of duty, but curiosity. It wasn't loud. In fact, it seemed more imagined than real, as though the idea of it echoed ahead of him. He followed the sound, winding through the brush, until the path ended abruptly, in a clearing he wouldn't have noticed, if not for the absence of trees. In the center sat a small stone house, barely wider than 2 arm spans, its roof shingled with flat slates, darkened by age. A bell hung above the door. Not a church bell, but the kind used to call someone in from the fields. Modest and dented, suspended by a length of braided rope that swayed gently though there was no wind. Ellis stopped just outside the clearing. He waited. The bell gave one soft chime, then stilled. A moment later, the door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, in the way trees are tall, not quickly, but inevitably, his frame draped in a robe that looked stitched from mismatched patches of wool, each square a different muted color. His beard was full, but orderly gray, streaked with black, and his eyes were the kind that saw more than was said. "You're early?" "Olver," said his voice, like pages turning in an old book. Ellis smiled faintly. "Seems to be a theme lately. You were sent pointed. Maybe." Olver studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind him. Ellis followed. The interior was dim but warm, the hearth alive with a low fire. Shelves lined the walls, each cluttered with objects that resisted easy definition. Bundles of feathers tied with twine, jars filled with layered sand, a small bowl holding 6 identical stones with holes worn perfectly through their centers. A single chair faced the hearth beside a table covered in papers, some blank, some covered in looping script, too tidy to be accidental. Olver gestured to a stool near the door. Ellis sat. For a time, neither spoke. Then Olver asked, "What did you take?" Ellis hesitated. "A bolt of cloth. Or I thought it was. And what was it? I don't know. But someone wants it back. Desperately." Olver nodded once. Slowly, as though confirming something long suspected. "There are threads in this world," he said, "that hold more than we expect. Stories, secrets, patterns waiting to be read." He reached toward a shelf, pulled down a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth, and opened it to reveal a strip of fabric, not identical, but similar to the one Ellis remembered. "It's not what's woven." Olver continued running a finger along the edge. "But how? Who touched it? When?" "Some items absorb intent." Ellis frowned. "Intent. A wish, a curse, a secret passed hand to hand. Cloth is patient. It listens. So what does mine say?" Olver looked up, and for the first time, his expression shifted. Mild surprise, touched with something softer. "That's what we'll find out." He turned, set the bundle on the table, and reached for something hidden beneath the papers. The bell outside rang once without touch or wind. Olver paused. "They're close," he said quietly. "We'll have to be careful." Ellis leaned forward, voice low. "What do we do?" Olver looked at him and said, "We read." Then he unrolled a parchment covered in strange symbols and lit a second candle, its flame flickering sideways, as though already bracing for what came next. The candle flame swayed oddly for a moment, casting narrow shadows that stretched along the walls, like fingers reaching for forgotten books. And then it steadied, burning low and steady in the quiet of the room, as Olver spread the parchment fully across the table, flattening it with the careful, reverent pressure of someone smoothing out a memory that had been folded too long. Ellis leaned closer, squinting at the markings symbols that curved like vines and dots that clustered around them in patterns that suggested meaning but offered none immediately. Olver said nothing for several breaths, eyes scanning the symbols, occasionally tapping a spot with one finger, as if recalling an old song's next note. The fabric lay nearby, still folded, still unremarkable in its appearance, though now Ellis noticed it seemed to darken slightly near the edges, as though absorbing more of the candlelight than it should a trick of the weave or the light, or both. "This is old work," Olver finally murmured. "Not from one place, but passed through many. It's layered, not in fibers, but in intent." Ellis raised an eyebrow. "You mean it's cursed?" "No, Olver," said his voice precise. "Curses are simple, one voice shouting at fate. This is more like a choir humming something forgotten." He reached into a drawer and retrieved a magnifying glass with a handle carved from antler, then used it to examine the threads of the cloth closely holding it at angles that caught the candlelight just so. "There's writing in here," he muttered. "Not ink. Placement. The die patterns see here form sigils, but not all at once, only when folded." He adjusted the cloth, folded one corner over itself, then another, and the shapes appeared subtle, dark on dark, like bruises blooming beneath the surface. "These aren't decorative. This is cartography. Someone mapped something into this fabric." Ellis leaned closer. "A map to what?" "Hard to say," Olver replied, "but it's layered in threes. One of the old methods. 3 paths, 3 truths. One false. Whoever made this wanted only the right reader to find the right way." The bell outside rang again. Not loud, but longer. This time, the rope swaying slightly in the doorway's shadow. Olver froze, listening. They're at the clearing edge," he said quietly. "They won't come closer yet. They're waiting to see if the bell lies." Ellis stood instinctively, reaching for his satchel. "What do we do?" Olver remained still, then turned to a narrow cabinet and withdrew a slender rod of iron, its end wrapped in copper wire. He handed it to Ellis. "This will hum if they step past the threshold. Not loud. Feel it in your palm. If it sings, we move." Ellis took the rod, held it loosely. It felt cold, not from temperature, but from something deeper, as though it remembered being made for a purpose that still hadn't arrived. Olver returned to the cloth, unfolding it completely, now laying it out flat, and then tracing the lines again with one long finger. "This center mark," he said. "It repeats. That's deliberate. Whoever made this encoded a pivot, a place where the path can split. It could mean a crossroads or a person." Ellis stared at the center. It looked like a loop at first glance, but then it resolved into something else, a circle within a triangle flanked by two marks shaped like old tally strokes. "It's a marker," Olver continued. "Could be physical or metaphorical. You are here, but only if you've been elsewhere. First." The rod in Ellis's hand tingled, faint and sudden, like a spark, jumping between words, not yet spoken. "They're closer," he said. Olver nodded. "Then we'll need to decide what's worth carrying." He opened a hidden drawer in the table and pulled out a roll of thick parchment bound with wax cord. "This is the key. Not to the cloth itself, but to the places it points. This is what they're chasing. Not the item, the meaning." Ellis felt a tightness in his chest, not fear, but clarity. So they don't even know. They suspect. And that's worse. Outside, a twig snapped. Ellis stepped to the window, just enough to peer through the slat. Nothing moved. But the forest had grown still again, the kind of quiet that warned of breath being held. "We can't stay," he said. "Not long," Olver agreed. "But you'll need to carry this onward. South still. Always south." The path narrows, then opens. He packed the cloth carefully, wrapping it in fresh linen and placing it inside a leather pouch. He handed the pouch to Ellis, then added the rod of iron, now less reactive, but still faintly cold. "There's a glade," he said, 2 miles east of the ridge bend. An old way station. Abandoned, but still holding echoes. Stay there tonight. It will confuse pursuit. The next morning, find the standing stone with no name. That's where the map becomes more than fabric. Ellis shouldered the satchel again, the weight shifting subtly with the new addition. He looked around the small house, at the jars, the papers, the fire that had dimmed to coals. "What about you?" Olver smiled faint and knowing. "I was never here." Then he turned to the table, picked up the old magnifier, and resumed his study of the parchment, as though the world hadn't just narrowed its focus. Ellis stepped to the door, paused as the bell gave one final chime, and then crossed the threshold. The trees welcomed him back with silence. He did not look behind. The forest stretched out before him, winding, uncertain, and very much awake. The forest closed around Ellis as he stepped away from the clearing. The sound of the bell behind him fading until it was just a whisper tucked beneath the rustle of leaves and the occasional complaint of a distant crow. The sky overhead had turned a thick, featureless gray, pressing down like a ceiling of wet wool. And the promise of rain that Mara had mentioned earlier now carried more conviction with every sluggish breeze. He moved quickly, not at a run, but with the long, careful stride of someone who expected the path to vanish underfoot at any moment. The pouch Olver had given him shifted against his back, inside the satchel, the wrapped cloth surprisingly heavy for something so soft. It didn't clink or creak, but it felt watchful, the kind of object that made its presence known by resisting forgetfulness. He resisted the urge to check it again. Instead, he focused on the path, or what passed for one, as it meandered away from the clearing, skirting patches of moss too bright to be trustworthy, and tree roots that erupted from the ground like reminders that the forest had its own plans. The mapmaker's ridge was still behind him now, and the world here tilted subtly eastward, nudging him toward the way station Olver had mentioned. If there was a trail, it didn't care about being obvious, so Ellis relied on other signs, the angle of tree growth, the thinning of underbrush, the occasional stack of flat stones that looked too deliberate to be natural. By midday, the rain had arrived in a half-hearted drizzle, the kind that soaked everything eventually, but never fully committed to the drama of a storm. Ellis pulled his cloak tighter. Hood up, boots squelching with each step through the increasingly soggy terrain. The forest changed again here, the tall oaks giving way to younger birch trees that clustered in groups like children, whispering secrets behind cupped hands. The light, such as it was, turned pale and watery, the ground soft with decades of leaf decay, and the occasional, unexpected puddle that appeared with no warning or apology. Then, through the trees ahead, he saw it a break in the brush, a space that wasn't quite a clearing, but had clearly been shaped once by human hands. The way station. It wasn't a building, not anymore. Just a low stone foundation, barely 3 feet high, covered in moss, and surrounded by remnants of timber that leaned inward like elderly men trying to recall an old joke. One wall remained mostly upright, with a rusted iron hinge still embedded in the stone, suggesting a door had once guarded this place, or perhaps welcomed those who knew how to knock. Ellis stepped over the low threshold boots, scraping against old flagstones, and paused. The air here felt still, but not dead. There was a texture to it, like breathing inside a room where someone had just finished speaking. He set down his satchel in the corner, where the stones were driest, shrugged off his cloak, and stretched the stiffness from his shoulders. The pouch remained inside the bag untouched, but not unnoticed. He reached into the satchel's side pocket and withdrew a small knife, the dull one he still carried more out of habit than utility, and began trimming a bit of bark from a nearby log, not for any reason except to make noise. Silence was fine, but silence that watched you needed interruption. He stayed there for some time, whittling the bark into slivers, then arranging them into a tiny, pointless pile. The rain thickened briefly, then thinned again, as if embarrassed by its own persistence. Birds chirped in the distance, too far to be helpful, and the wind moved through the trees in irregular bursts, never quite enough to dry anything. Near evening, he explored the surrounding brush, moving in widening circles around the ruin, noting the position of the sun as it dipped behind the clouds, guessing east and west by the brighter patch of sky. He found an old fire ring hidden beneath the leaves, just a few blackened stones, and the faint scent of ash when stirred. Someone else had used this place, not recently, but not centuries ago either. A broken spoon lay half buried in the dirt, rusted thin. He returned to the stone wall, sat again, and leaned back with a soft grunt, pulling the satchel into his lap. Now finally, he unwrapped the pouch. The cloth inside had not changed, still soft, still oddly heavy, still marked with the strange, almost invisible sigils Olver had traced by candlelight. But something about it felt more definite here, like it recognized this place, or perhaps the memory of it. Ellis unfolded it fully, laid it across his knees, and stared. The same pattern emerged, the triangle, the circle, the tallies, but now other shapes edged into view, darkened slightly by the damp, or maybe drawn out by the air. He traced one with his finger, a curve that began as part of a loop, and then broke away, pointing toward a mark on the far left corner. He tilted the cloth slightly, and noticed faintly another set of marks, not drawn, but woven, appearing only when the weave caught light at a particular slant. They looked like coordinates, or instructions. He retrieved the rod of iron from his bag, the one Olver had given him. It didn't hum now, but it felt warmer in his hand, as if responding to the presence of the cloth. When he held it near the center pattern, the iron seemed to buzz faintly, a low vibration that settled into his bones like a remembered melody. He moved it across the fabric, watching for changes, and the rod pulsed slightly when passed over one corner, the same place the curve had pointed. A location, perhaps, or a direction. He folded the cloth again carefully and tucked it back into the pouch. The sun was gone now, and dusk settled in with the steady weight of something unbothered by urgency. He pulled his cloak back around him, positioned himself with his back to the standing wall, and waited. Not for sleep. Not yet. but for the quiet to shift, for something to change, for whatever came next. Because something was coming. He could feel it in the rod, the cloth, the way station's breath. The path was no longer just a trail. It was a story. And now finally, it was starting to speak. Night came, without ceremony, settling over the broken stones and damp soil of the way station, like a heavy blanket that hadn't been shaken out in years, its edges curling into every corner of the ruin, softening shapes, muting colors, and pressing the world into silence, except for the occasional drip of rainwater from the overburdened leaves above. Ellis sat with his back to the mossy wall, cloak wrapped tightly, the faint pulse of the iron rod resting across his thigh, a reminder that silence didn't always mean safety. The cloth remained tucked in the satchel, carefully folded, but its presence was unmistakable now, a warmth at his side that seemed to hum in rhythm with his breathing. The low fire he'd coaxed from damp twigs and the remains of old bark smoked more than it flamed, but the glow it offered was enough to cast a small circle of light that did its best to hold back the weight of the dark. He didn't expect to sleep. Not really, but sometime past midnight, his eyes closed for longer than a blink, and when they opened again, something had changed. The fire was lower, barely embers now, and yet the clearing was brighter, faintly illuminated by a light that didn't come from flame or moon, but from something quieter and less certain. At the far edge of the ruin, near where the low stone wall gave way to overgrown brush, stood a figure, not cloaked, not armed, just standing, watching. Ellis didn't move. The figure did not speak. After a long pause, it lifted a hand, not in threat, but in greeting. Then it pointed downward, toward the foundation stones beneath its feet. Slowly, Ellis rose, the iron rod gripped loosely, not as a weapon, but as a compass. He stepped over the remains of the fire and crossed the mossy floor boots silent on damp stone. As he neared, the figure stepped back, fading not into shadow, but into the texture of the night itself, disappearing without hurry or sound. Ellis stopped where it had stood, looked down. The stones here were older, less worn, their outlines more defined, and beneath the moss, a pattern. He knelt, brushed aside the damp green, revealing carvings, lines, and curves that mirrored those in the cloth. The same triangle, the same circle, smaller, here cruder, but unmistakable. He pulled the pouch from his satchel, unfolded the cloth, and held it over the stone. The match was imperfect, but close enough to feel intentional. He reached for the rod, brought it near the center of the pattern, and again it vibrated, faintly stronger this time, as though recognizing a kindred note. Then, beneath the cloth and moss, something clicked. Not loudly, just the softest mechanical whisper, like a latch giving up an old secret. A section of stone shifted barely half an inch, but enough to see it wasn't solid. Ellis placed his fingers on the edge and lifted. The stone was heavier than it should have been for something so thin, but it moved, revealing a hollow beneath, no deeper than a loaf of bread, lined with wood, now blackened by age, and within it a small object wrapped in oilcloth. He reached in, drew it out, and carefully unwrapped it. A box, wooden inlaid with brass, so tarnished it looked green. No lock, but a latch carved with the same triangle and circle motif. Ellis hesitated, then opened it. Inside, a scroll tightly wound and sealed with wax, bearing no emblem. Alongside it, a small pendant of lead, or something duller, shaped like a teardrop, with a hole through the top, and faint lines etched into its sides. No writing, just grooves spiraling. Deliberate. He turned the pendant over in his fingers, then set it back into the box and lifted the scroll. The seal cracked with surprising ease. He unrolled it slowly. The parchment inside was dense with markings, not words, but symbols, concentric designs that spiraled outward like a maze built from language, with paths leading toward a center and others away, all connected by loops that made little sense until he held the scroll close to the iron rod. At once, the lines shimmered faintly, as if reacting to proximity, not glowing exactly, but shifting, growing sharper at the edges. A map, maybe, or a message hidden in paths only visible under the right gaze. He sat back against the stone scroll in handcloth beside him, pendant glinting faintly near the box. Around him, the forest remained quiet, watching, but not intruding. The figure did not return. He studied the scroll, following the curves, noting where they mirrored those on the cloth. He remembered what Olver had said, 3 paths, 1. False. This could be one of them, or perhaps the key to reading them all. He rewrapped the scroll, placed it back in the box, and tucked the whole thing deep into his satchel, layering it beneath the cloth. Then he sat in the dimness and waited for the sun to catch up with his thoughts. The morning would come. It always did. But when it did, he would have to choose which line to follow. And in the quiet moment before dawn, he realized that the cloth hadn't been the secret at all. It had been the invitation. The true story had only just begun whispering. And the forest, the stones, the silent figure they were listening to. Dawn filtered through the canopy in thin strands, pale and indecisive, casting just enough light to soften the shadows. Clinging to the broken stone walls of the way station. Ellis stirred from his half-sleep eyes, gritty limbs stiff from the chill that had crept into his joints during the long hours of not quite rest. The fire had died to ash, a cold gray smudge that smoldered only in memory, and around him the forest exhaled a mist that clung to leaves and gathered in the hollows of the trail, like breath held too long. He sat up slowly, checking the satchel. First, its weight reassuring the box still beneath the cloth, the rod of iron tucked beside it, the pendant wrapped in a corner of his spare shirt. Nothing missing. Nothing moved. He took a long drink from his water skin, chewed a piece of hard biscuit that had seen better centuries, and then stood brushing moss from his sleeves. The symbol-carved stones where the figure had pointed were already fading beneath the return of dew and leaf litter, as though the forest was trying to forget what it had allowed him to see. He did not try to uncover them again. Some things once found did not need repeating. Instead, he repacked his things, adjusted the satchel so the box sat close to the curve of his spine, and turned east toward the standing stone Olver had spoken of, the nameless marker where cloth and map might speak in unison. The trail was fainter now, more instinct than path, but he followed the signs, a row of trees spaced too evenly to be natural, a notch in a boulder shaped like an open eye, a crooked stump that leaned away from the rising sun, like it disapproved of the morning altogether. Birds called out half-hearted greetings. A fox blinked at him from beneath a bramble and decided he wasn't worth the trouble. By mid-morning, the forest began to thin. The trees smaller, their trunks paler, bark peeling in ribbons like secrets trying to escape. And then he saw it, the standing stone. It rose from the earth, not like it had been placed, but like it had grown there, rough and pitted, covered in lichen, the color of old bruises, and utterly devoid of markings. No name, no carvings, just presence. He approached slowly, footsteps crunching on dry needles, and paused a few paces away, unsure if the air around the stone actually felt different, or if his nerves were inventing sensations just to stay useful. The iron rod buzzed faintly in his pack. He withdrew it, held it near the stone, and felt the vibration increase, not violently, but steadily, like a voice clearing its throat before speaking. He crouched, laid the cloth out on the ground, smoothing it gently over a patch of dry moss. The symbols shimmered more clearly, now the triangle and circle aligning almost perfectly with the angles of the stone. He set the pendant beside the cloth, then unrolled the spiral-marked scroll and watched as the curves glowed faintly, reacting to their surroundings like ink learning to breathe. One of the spirals near the center pulsed softly, its outline thickening. A map within a map. A choice. Ellis reached for the pendant, holding it over the scroll, letting it dangle on its string. As it hovered, it spun not fast, not chaotically, but with a steady, deliberate motion, aligning itself to a point on the spiral, as though drawn not by gravity, but by memory. He moved it slightly. It resisted. He let go, and it settled into place. There, a location or a direction. The center of the spiral began to shift, its lines curling outward, with new emphasis, drawing attention to a break in the pattern, a gap small but precise, like a door someone had forgotten to close. He stared at the gap, then at the standing stone, then at the cloth now softly pulsing, as if aware of his attention. Then he stood, walked to the stone, and pressed his palm against its cold, lichen-covered surface. Nothing happened at first. Then the stone vibrated so subtly he thought it might have been his own heartbeat echoing. But it grew stronger, the tremor moving down his arm into his chest, humming through bone and breath like a song without melody. The cloth behind him shifted. Not blown by wind, there was none, but moved by something internal, a ripple that passed through its weave like a sigh. He turned and saw the center of the cloth pattern glowing gently, a new line forming where none had been, before a straight line cutting across the spiral, slicing toward the edge of the fabric like an arrow. A path revealed. One of the three. Maybe the true one. He folded the cloth carefully, replaced the scroll in its container, slipped the pendant around his neck beneath his shirt, and stood. The standing stone gave no further sign. It had shown him what it could. It would not speak again. He turned south, the new direction, sharp in his mind. Now, not a place on a map, but a certainty in his ribs, a tug like gravity made personal. Trees closed in again, the trail narrowing, and as he walked, the iron rod remained quiet, but the pendant grew warm where it touched his skin, pulsing in time with steps that no longer felt entirely his own. The map was guiding him now, not toward safety, not toward escape, but toward something deeper, something waiting to be found. The forest thickened around Ellis as he followed the line revealed by the cloth's glow, the path narrowing into a faint trace barely distinguishable from the surrounding undergrowth. The trees leaned in closer, here their branches weaving overhead to form a canopy that filtered the daylight into a muted, green-tinted twilight. The air was damp and cool, filled with the scent of moss earth and something faintly metallic that tingled at the edges of his senses as if the very atmosphere was charged with anticipation. His boots pressed into soft soil, muffled footsteps swallowed by the dense forest floor. The pendant warmed against his chest, pulsing steadily, a silent companion, guiding him onward. Every now and then, the iron rod at his side vibrated softly, as if reminding him that the unseen watchers remained near their presence, a shadow at the edge of his journey. The path twisted and turned, climbing and dipping over roots and stones, leading him through groves of birch and ash, past quiet pools that mirrored the pale sky and the moving canopy above. He moved steadily, mind alert, but body weary, the weight of the satchel and the mysteries it contained pressing gently against his back, like a constant whisper of purpose. Time lost meaning here. Hours folded into moments, the sun's passage, obscured by the thick branches, the world reduced to the rhythm of his steps, the pulse of the pendant, and the soft hum of the forest's breath. At last, the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing that felt less like a place and more like a secret waiting to be shared. In the center stood a stone circle, weathered and worn, but unmistakably deliberate, each monolith standing sentinel around a patch of earth where grass grew tall and wildflowers bloomed in hesitant bursts of color. The air here was different, lighter, charged with a quiet energy that prickled the skin and slowed the breath. Ellis approached slowly, heart steady, despite the unfamiliarity, and stepped into the circle's center. The pendant pulsed warmly, its glow visible beneath his shirt, a steady beacon against the encroaching shadows. He knelt, unfolding the cloth once more, laying it flat on the ground, where the soft earth seemed to welcome it, pressing its patterns gently into the soil. The spiral and lines shimmered faintly, their edges blurring and reforming, as if alive, responding to the circle's ancient power. The iron rod hummed softly in his hand, vibrations rising and falling like a song only he could hear. Ellis traced a finger along the glowing path on the cloth, feeling the weight of countless hands that had passed this way, the echoes of stories woven into the very fabric beneath him. The pendant's warmth spread a comforting pulse, syncing with his own heartbeat, guiding him to a spot near one of the tallest stones. There, buried just beneath the surface, his fingers found a small depression, the soil softer and warmer. He reached into his satchel, and retrieved the wooden box, opening it to reveal the scroll. Unrolling it carefully, he laid the parchment beside the cloth, watching as the symbols on both began to resonate lines, connecting, spiraling together into a single pattern that stretched beyond the edges of either piece. The ground trembled faintly, a subtle shift that sent a ripple through the circle and rustled the grass around him. Ellis looked up, eyes scanning the standing stones, sensing the weight of ages pressing down, as if the very earth had been holding its breath for his arrival. The air thickened with expectation, the forest holding its secrets a moment longer before releasing them gently into the fading light. Somewhere deep in the distance, a bell tolled softly, not from a tower or a church, but from the heart of the woods, calling out a signal only the patient could hear. Ellis rose slowly, the mystery of the cloth and scroll finally merging into a path laid bare. A story whispered in threads and stone. He gathered his things, the pendant cool against his skin now, and stepped beyond the circle's edge into the darkening woods, where the path awaited the next step, unknown and inevitable. The journey was far from over, but here, at the convergence of map and meaning, the path opened, and Ellis walked forward, carrying the quiet weight of secrets still to be unraveled.